Good afternoon. This is the Healing Our Brokenness podcast, where we dissect problems and solutions that exist among broken people living in a broken world. And we also believe here at Healing Our Brokenness podcast that talking through our stories is the path that leads to walking through our healing. Today we are celebrating episode 94, and it is entitled Black History Part 1. As a special for you guys today, I want to read a good section of the first chapter in a book that I self-published, and that was 5 years ago. In a few weeks, it'll be 5 years ago that I published my first book, and it is entitled The Journey. And about a week ago, I republished that book, completely revamped the book, and it has a whole different feel to it. And so what I'm going to do is read the chapter that is entitled Childhood, and I hope and pray that you would enjoy it.
There was a son, he was devoured by earth. There was a God, they call him the Father.
Childhood. Everybody has a story, no matter how painful they are. Our stories are our stories. They are messy, soul-wrenching, and filled with brokenness. But at the end of the day, they are our stories. Sometimes we wish that we could take an eraser and remove all the bad parts. Like we removed the cursive words on the chalkboard when the teacher was done teaching class. However, there is one thing that is true. Rejecting our stories does not make our stories look better. For when we reject our stories, we are in essence rejecting ourselves. When we reject ourselves, then we accept non-integration of ourselves. Non-integration of ourselves means rejection of wholeness. And finally, rejection of wholeness means acceptance of splitting and limited healing. And we do not want that. Every one of our stories represents a patch on the quilt called humanity. Our stories are important because they help us understand our writing, our identity, and the whys behind both. They help our children and further generations put the pieces of the puzzle together for their own lives. Our stories do not just involve us. They go back several generations. If I went back to the beginning of my story, I would have to go back to Africa, where my ancestors were sold as slaves, then placed on ships, headed to America against their will. But I won't go back that far. I will go back to the South, specifically Opelousas, Louisiana, where my grandmother was born. In most Black families, everybody has either a big mama, Nana, or Madea, who is the matriarch of the family. We had a Madea, and she was officially named Beatrice Ford, born from the union of Ophelia and Walter Ford. Her parents had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Madea's brothers were Robert, Clarence, Lawrence, and Walter. And her sister was named Ophelia after their mom. Sadly, their mother, Ophelia, died when my grandmother was around 4 years old. The only thing that she remembered about her mom is the fact that she spoke French and her skin complexion was blue-black. Blue-black was a term that I heard in the Black community when someone was so dark and beautiful that their skin seemed to shine with an almost bluish golden illumination. Medea and Ophelia ended up sporting shaven, boyish haircuts due to their father having some sort of machinery accident. I guess he figured combing hair would be one less thing that he had to be concerned about. Although my grandmother only attended school until the 5th grade, she was there long enough to learn how to read. Her next step after 5th grade was helping a family make a living. Medea never grew tired of telling me and my cousins about her 5th grade teacher getting on the boys for their naughty behavior towards her in class. Please don't hit Beatrice on her big legs. If this were an Instagram quote, this would be where the laugh out loud emoji would be inserted. Later on, Medea and her family parted ways. It was kind of like an Abraham and Lot situation where Abraham gave Lot first pick as to which land that him and his family would live on. Except in this case, I'm not sure of the background story of how Medea and her sister Ophelia ended up in Memphis, Tennessee, and their brothers in Angleton, Texas. Black folks in general, and particularly Black folks in the South, have a lot of weird nicknames. And if you ask about the origin of the name, sometimes you get a direct answer. And other times, the person doesn't have a clue as to how that name came to be. Let's start with Monkey Man, my mother's father. I have no clue as to where that name came from. His real name was Arthur. And then you have my uncle whose first nickname was Zippy, but was later changed to Larry. No explanation. My aunt Pea Stew probably got her nickname because of her and my grandmother having the same first name, Beatrice. And since my aunt's last name was West, like her dad's, Pea Stew probably stuck to distinguish Little and Big Beatrice. My Aunt Dolores was the only one without a different nickname. You just X'd out the D-E and you had Lois. Maybe it had something to do with her being the oldest child. There was also no explanation for my other aunt's nickname. It is Nikolai, although we seem to have shortened it over the years to Nookie. My grandmother did give me the explanation for my mother's nickname, Ducky. She walked like a duck, plain and simple. Monkey Man and his dad, Papi, had an intense relationship. And I say intense because Papi ended up hitting Monkey Man in the head with an axe, leaving a soft spot as that of a baby's head when they came right out of the womb. Doctors encouraged Monkey Man to eventually get a plate put in his head, or it could cost him his life. And sadly, that is exactly what happened. He got into a brawl with a man over a woman and died of severe head trauma within a couple of weeks. Papi was married to Daphne West, affectionately called Mommy. I remember little of Mommy. I remember the time right before she died. She was so weak that my mother and her siblings had to take turns feeding her. They have a different Mommy that they remember, a short, beautiful, caramel complexioned, feisty woman with long white hair who loved having her hair brushed and having the grandkids reciting Bible verses while they did it. She had a lot of funny Southern ways and unfortunately got caught up in colorism, where she thought that being light-skinned was better. Although my mother loved going to visit Mommy, This colorism came up when my mother, who is dark skinned, was told to make sure that she scrubbed her skin really hard when she washed up. For some strange reason, it was almost as if Mommy thought my mother's complexion was going to change color if she scrubbed harder. Now, Ducky, you know that your skin is dark, and so you need to scrub real hard with alcohol, because I don't think all of that is your true skin color. She had a similar comment when it came to brushing her teeth. Growing up Black meant that you had to face the stereotypes and prejudices that other races had for you. And then you had to face the same prejudices and stereotypes within your own race, which were based upon what the system had taught you. Unfortunately, Black folks from the South have slowly passed on amongst each other the habits of how the slave owners treated the light-skinned Black children. We always repeat what we don't heal. Although the family was poor, Mommy was able to maintain her own vegetable garden and often used her produce as part of their family meals. Whenever my mother and her siblings visited Mommy's house, she would wake them up at the crack of dawn to clean up the house. Y'all get up, you never know who's coming by the house. I'm not quite sure who would have had the nerve to visit someone at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, but these were her standards. It appears that the stronghold of perfectionism had a hook on both sides of my mother's parents' families. It is also one of the many coping mechanisms that my family used to deal with: loss, grief, and trauma. Cleaning is one way of being able to control something when you can't control the drama, the struggles, and the pain and hurt that life throws at you. Although my mother grew up extremely poor, she recanted many stories that were filled with having fun as a kid, playing outside in old tubs, walking miles to wherever they needed to go, including downtown Memphis area, and getting tanned several shades darker in the hot Memphis sun was all part of it. Halloween involved putting on your parents' dresses, high heels, and jewelry to go trick-or-treating. Some of the neighbors demanded that they were shown a trick before they gave out the treat. One time, my mother thought it was a good idea to see what picking beans was all about. Yep, beans, not cotton. My Aunt Lois had a job doing it, and so my mother decided to go just for once for the experience. A bus picked them up at around 5 o'clock a.m., returning them to the drop-off spot 12 hours later. My mother decided this would be her last time doing it because she nearly died of heat exhaustion from standing out in the Mississippi sun picking beans. At the end of the day, they got little money for an extensive amount of work. Being that her childhood was during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, she got a chance to experience what it felt like to see the signs on the water fountains and other places that put you in your place in case you forgot. Whites only, Blacks only. She also had the privilege of sitting on the front porch of her home, which was right around the corner from where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stayed at the Lorraine Motel when he was there in Memphis, Tennessee. He had come to Memphis to help with the sanitation workers. Little did he know this would be his last trip on the bus called life. My grandmother and her sister Ophelia had been able to participate in the March on Washington with Dr. King, along with other civil rights movements. And after Dr. King was killed, there were riots, looting, and all kinds of chaos going on in the streets. National Guardsmen had to be called in to regain control over the city. There was a mandatory curfew put in place, along with unfair and harsh treatment to get folks to comply. My mother and aunts witnessed their brother and cousin being beat with billy clubs. Their unfair and harsh treatment of my relatives set my auntie Pistu off into a ranting of colorful words in response to their behavior. She was not going to willingly let anyone hurt her relatives. Pistu was fierce, a force to be reckoned with. At the age of 18, my Aunt Lois got married and moved to Chicago. This prompted Madea to follow suit with the rest of her children up north, except Larry, who begged to stay south and live with Mommy. This was during what we called the Great Migration. Surely Chicago and anything north would be better than the caste system of the South. Little did they know they would still be enslaved as blacks. Northern cities had a different way of displaying racism. It was the same box, simply different wrapping paper with several bows attached. My mother was 12 at the time that she moved to Chicago. Madea had allowed her to stay with her sister Ophelia and finish out the school year. She transferred over to middle school in Chicago and had to make the best of a bad poverty situation. Her school wardrobe consisted of a few tops and 2 skirts. In the beginning, there were several mornings when my mother cried for money to take to school. Madea simply did not have it. I was born in the cold winter month of February. And if you have grown up in Chi-Town, you know that the winters are nothing nice. When the wind chills drop, the wind cuts through you so badly, you forget that you dressed in 2 to 3 layers before leaving the house. My cousin Toria described my arrival to Madea's house as being strange. Strange meaning that my mother protected me as if I lived in a bubble. Strange as in nobody could look at Tina. My mother's words echoed in her ears. Please don't touch her or don't breathe on her. I don't want any germs to get on her. My parents were teenagers at the time, doing the best that they could and about to navigate a whole new world that even they themselves were not prepared for. However, my mother's willingness to learn and living there with Madea, functioning as my second mother, was just what I needed for a setup of stability and safety as a kid. God had a purpose in mind when I came into this world, just as he has plans and a purpose for each and every one of his children. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. Little did I know that this purpose would be revealed through such pain and brokenness 40 years later. For the first 8 years of my life, my mom, dad, and I lived with Madea and my 2 aunts in her tiny apartment in the projects that were known as Madden Park Homes. The apartment that we lived in was packed to the max with people and roaches, but I knew that I was loved. My cousin Toria lived 20 minutes away from Madea's house, and so that made it even better. In the summers, we hung out all day, every day. During the school year, we hung out on the weekends. We never grew tired of being with our friends and planning all kinds of games and activities to do with them. And even though we were extremely poor, our minds were not focused on this reality. Our family, friends, and community made up our world. Even when our world was filled with family drama, we bounced back and kept going. It was the message that was put in our DNA from the beginning of time when we weren't able to use our voices to make a difference. Tori and I were more like sisters. She grew up with two brothers, Kiwi and Cedric, and they pretty much either hung out together or with their own friends. And even so, in Black families, cousins are tight. They are like siblings, and you tend to have the same kind of sibling rivalry among the cousins as you did among a regular family unit, competing for the aunties, uncles, and grandmother's attention. Madia gave us our first lesson in what it meant to have community. She invited people from all walks of life into that tiny apartment. The alcoholic, drug addict, and brokenhearted were all welcome. Although she was not a woman of a lot of words, there was something about her presence that let you know that you were loved and accepted. No one received the unspoken message, you are too broken to be here. Sometimes Madia would sit on her couch or bed, and the grandkids would come and sit next to her to feel the warmth of her big arms. And you could not help but notice that her meals were wrapped in love. Working tirelessly in the kitchen, you would witness beads of sweat running down her forehead as she hollered out, God bless America. I still do not know how she fed all of us on $6. Only God knows how to do that kind of math. She was more like the widow at Zarephath, who told Elijah that she only had a little bit of food left, and then her and her son would die. The widow trusted God and fed Elijah first, and so did Madia. She fed her family first, and she ate last. Every 2 weeks, it was hair pressing time. Madia would press me and my cousin's hair. She would go in order from the oldest to the youngest. So Toria went first, then me, then Tara. The tiny kitchen was a beauty shop with a pillow slip full of clean or dirty clothes for the beauty shop chair. Madia will give us the Blue Magic or bergamot hair grease top to put over our ears to protect them from being burned. Then the next thing you knew, ouch, that hurt. Madia, I think you burned me. No, that was just the hot grease running through your scalp. Majority of the times, this was true. Every blue moon, there was a crispy feeling at the top of our ears where we had gotten burned. And sure enough, a few days later, it would turn black. Not once did Madia complain about doing our hair. And as Toria would say, she was persistent and consistent with everything she did. Even those times when we knew we should not have been playing in the hydrant water, wetting up our entire head after getting it pressed, Madia didn't complain. She would shake her head as if to say, Lord, help me. To say that Madia was an extraordinarily strong woman would be an understatement. She had been through a very abusive relationship with Monkey Man. He had cycles of being a good dad and partner during the week, and then when it came to the weekends after getting paid, there were cycles of letting the alcohol take full control. This led Madia to hiding out when the bill collectors came around to get their money. As a kid, there was only one time that I ever saw Madia cry. When I did, it grieved my heart. I literally felt her pain and sadness. She had accidentally cut her tongue on a hard sucker, and it was bleeding profusely. My grandmother was a remarkably simple woman who was content with doing the following: cooking, wearing her long house dresses, walking barefoot around the house, watching her stories, soap operas, drinking her coffee, and being around her family. She had learned the same secret that Paul teaches us about in Philippians 4:11 through 13. I am not saying this because I am in need. for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. I hope that you have enjoyed the Black History reading that I gave to you, which is coming from the book entitled The Journey, and the republished edition is already out and on Amazon. I want to thank you as my listeners for being faithful every single week, coming out here, listening to podcasts, hitting up your friends and letting them know about the Healing Our Brokenness podcast. And I want to ask you again, if you will do that, if Healing Our Brokenness is making a difference in your life, if you would invite your friends to sign up, to subscribe on Spotify, Castos.com, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music. And I also want to give a shout out to Timothy Horton, who's bringing our intro and outro music every single week. Until next